December 7, 1941. The date that would forever alter the Pacific landscape saw Japanese aircraft descending upon Pearl Harbor like iron rain, confident in their empire's invincibility. Yet within the smoke and chaos of that devastating attack lay the seeds of a strategic nightmare that would haunt Japanese military planners for years to come. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, had awakened a sleeping giant. But what truly terrified the Japanese high command in the months that followed wasn't America's industrial might alone. It was the revolutionary warfare strategy that would emerge from the ashes of defeat. The Japanese Empire had swept across the Pacific with unprecedented speed in early 1942, claiming territory from the Philippines to the Solomon Islands. Their defensive perimeter stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, dotted with fortified islands that formed what they believed to be an impenetrable barrier. Japanese commanders celebrated these early victories, convinced their strategy of creating a vast defensive ring would protect the homeland indefinitely. Every island fortress, they reasoned, would force the Americans into costly frontal assaults, bleeding the enemy white until they sued for peace. But in the sweltering heat of the South Pacific, two American commanders were developing a plan that would shatter Japanese confidence and revolutionize modern warfare. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, and General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Common, of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, recognized that attacking every Japanese stronghold would be suicidal. According to historical military records preserved in the National Archives, their alternative approach, dubbed island hopping or leapfrogging, would bypass heavily fortified positions, isolating them while seizing strategically vital islands to establish forward bases for the advance toward Japan. The strategy's brilliance lay in its simplicity and psychological impact. Rather than confronting the enemy's strength, American forces would exploit his geography. Heavily defended islands like Rabaul and Truk, which the Japanese had transformed into seemingly impregnable fortresses, with tens of thousands of troops, would be left to wither on the vine, as MacArthur famously declared. Meanwhile, American forces would seize lightly defended or strategically positioned islands, establishing airfields and supply bases that effectively cut off Japanese garrisons from reinforcement and resupply. Japanese military intelligence first detected this pattern in late 1942 during the Guadalcanal campaign. Initially dismissed as opportunistic raids, the American landings soon revealed a disturbing coherence. Japanese commanders realized with growing horror that their extensive defensive network had become a liability. Thousands of their finest troops found themselves marooned on isolated islands, consuming precious resources while contributing nothing to the empire's defense. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was profound and immediate. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, commanding Japanese forces in the Solomon Islands, reported to Imperial headquarters that American mobility and unpredictability had created a state of perpetual anxiety among his staff officers. They could no longer predict where the Americans would strike next. Every island garrison lived in fear that they would be the next target, or worse, that they would be bypassed entirely, condemned to slow starvation while watching American forces advance past them toward the Japanese homeland. This uncertainty became a weapon as devastating as any bomb, eroding Japanese morale from within their supposedly secure defensive perimeter. November 20th, 1943, marked the moment when island hopping evolved from theory into terrifying reality for the Japanese Empire. The assault on Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands demonstrated the brutal cost of amphibious warfare and the inexorable American advance that no amount of Japanese courage could stop. For 76 hours, the tiny island of Betio became a crucible of violence that would haunt both nations, but for vastly different reasons. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki had fortified Betio with fanatical dedication, boasting that 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. His 4,500 troops had transformed the 2-mile-long island into a maze of concrete bunkers, pillboxes, and carefully positioned artillery pieces. Japanese engineers had calculated every field of fire, anticipated every approach, and prepared every defensive position with meticulous precision. Shibasaki's confidence reflected the broader Japanese belief that their static defenses could bleed America dry. But the Americans who stormed Baitio's beaches represented something the Japanese had not fully comprehended: the industrial and logistical superiority of a mobilized democracy combined with hard-won tactical experience. Despite horrific casualties in the initial assault waves, with Marines wading through chest-deep water under withering fire, American forces adapted and overcame. The battle's outcome was never truly in doubt once the first American tanks reached the beach, though the fighting remained savage until the final Japanese defenders launched their last suicidal charge. The fall of Tarawa sent shockwaves through Tokyo that reverberated far beyond the loss of one small atoll. Japanese naval staff officers studying battle reports recognized a disturbing pattern. American casualties, over 3,000 killed and wounded in 76 hours, were considered acceptable losses by Washington, while Japan had lost an entire garrison with virtually no survivors. This calculus of attrition favored America's vastly superior replacement capacity. Moreover, the speed of Tarawa's conquest revealed that even Japan's most formidable defenses could be overwhelmed in days rather than months. Imperial General Headquarters received reports from surviving Japanese observers that painted an alarming picture of American capabilities, as documented in post-war interrogations preserved by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey. Japanese intelligence officers noted that American forces demonstrated unprecedented coordination between naval gunfire, aerial bomb, armament, and ground assault. The Americans had transformed amphibious warfare into a scientific operation, learning from each battle and implementing improvements at a pace that left Japanese defenders perpetually behind the tactical curve. What truly terrified Japanese commanders was the realization that Tarawa represented just one move in an accelerating advance. While Japanese troops died defending Baitio, American engineers were already surveying the captured island for airfield construction. Within weeks, American bombers operating from Tarawa would range hundreds of miles further into Japanese-held territory. Each captured island became a stepping stone for the next assault, creating a self-sustaining momentum that Japanese forces seemed powerless to stop. The psychological impact extended throughout the Japanese defensive perimeter. Garrisons on isolated islands understood that their strategic value had evaporated. They monitored radio broadcasts announcing American victories at Macon, Tarawa, and later the Marshall Islands, each success highlighting their own isolation. Japanese soldiers on bypassed islands like Truk and Rabaul experienced what one captured officer later described as the terror of irrelevance, knowing they would never face the enemy in battle, but would instead slowly perish from disease, starvation, and American air raids, while the war moved inexorably past them toward Japan itself. January 31, 1944, witnessed American forces launching Operation Flintlock, the invasion of the Marshall Islands, and with it came a refined version of the island-hopping strategy that would haunt Japanese military planners in their darkest hours. The Americans bypassed the heavily fortified Japanese base at Woche and instead struck directly at Kwajalein Atoll, the heart of Japan's Central Pacific defenses, demonstrating a boldness that shocked Tokyo's strategists. Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the American Fifth Fleet with calculated precision, bringing overwhelming force against selected targets while completely ignoring others. The Japanese High Command had anticipated that American forces would methodically reduce each island fortress in sequence, moving cautiously through the Marshalls. Instead, Spruance's fleet materialized at Kwajalein with devastating suddenness, bypassing 4 major Japanese garrisons that found themselves transformed overnight from strategic strongpoints into strategic irrelevancies. Major General Yoshimi Nishida, commanding Japanese forces at Woche, could only listen helplessly as radio transmissions described the destruction of his neighboring garrisons. His 8,000 troops sat idle on their fortified island, while American forces conquered Kwajalein just 200 miles away. Nishida's subsequent reports to Imperial Headquarters revealed profound frustration and mounting terror. He commanded a substantial force, equipped and supplied for extended combat, yet the war had simply moved past him. His garrison would spend the remainder of the conflict slowly consuming their supplies, enduring periodic American air raids, while contributing nothing to Japan's defense. The conquest of Kwajalein in just 4 days compared to the 3 days required for tiny Tarawa, demonstrated how rapidly American forces were mastering amphibious assault techniques. But the true strategic masterstroke came 3 weeks later when American forces seized Eniwetok Atoll at the western edge of the Marshalls. According to military historians analyzing declassified Pacific War records, this bold move placed American forces 1,000 miles closer to Japan than the nearest viable Japanese airbase, effectively neutralizing the entire Marshall Islands defensive network. Japanese naval aviation had suffered catastrophic losses throughout 1943, and the capture of the Marshalls exposed the Empire's inability to contest American naval supremacy. Admiral Minichi Koga, who had replaced the deceased Yamamoto as commander of the Sea-Umbined Fleet, recognized that Japan could no longer protect its far-flung garrisons. His staff calculated that American shipyards were producing vessels at a rate that exceeded Japan's entire pre-war navy every few months. The industrial disparity that Yamamoto had feared was manifesting with crushing reality. What made the Marshall Islands campaign particularly terrifying for Japanese defenders throughout the Pacific was its demonstration of American tactical learning. Each assault incorporated lessons from previous operations, improved landing craft, better naval gunfire coordination, refined close air, support procedures, and enhanced logistics. Japanese defenders noted with alarm that American casualties decreased with each successive operation, even as the speed of conquest increased. The Empire's strategy of inflicting unacceptable losses on the attackers was failing precisely when it was most desperately needed. The psychological warfare aspects of bypassing proved as devastating as any military defeat. Japanese garrisons on Woche, Maloelap, Mili, and Jaluit monitored American radio broadcasts celebrating victories while they languished in isolation. Disease, particularly malaria and dysentery, ravaged the bypassed garrisons. Food supplies dwindled as American submarines hunted down any Japanese vessels attempting resupply missions. Officers reported increasing cases of mental breakdown among their men, who understood they faced slow death without the honor of combat that Japanese military culture prized above all else. June 15, 1944, brought the nightmare scenario that Japanese military strategists had desperately tried to prevent. American forces landed on Saipan in the Mariana Islands, piercing the Empire's inner defensive ring and placing Japan's home islands within range of American bombers. The invasion of the Marianas represented not merely another island-hopping operation, but an existential threat that finally forced Tokyo to confront the terrifying reality of inevitable defeat. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito commanded 30,000 Japanese troops on Saipan, supported by substantial artillery and fortified positions across the island's mountainous terrain. Unlike isolated garrisons on bypassed islands, Saito's force represented one of Japan's last opportunities to inflict such devastating casualties that American public opinion might still force a negotiated peace. The Japanese High Command committed the remnants of its carrier aviation to support Saipan's defense, triggering what would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a one-sided aerial slaughter that destroyed Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. The Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19th and 20th demonstrated with brutal clarity that Japan had lost both qualitative and quantitative superiority in every combat domain. American pilots, flying superior aircraft and supported by radar-directed combat air patrols, destroyed approximately 400 Japanese planes, while losing fewer than 30 of their own. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's carrier force retreated in disarray, having accomplished nothing except confirming American dominance of the Pacific skies. Japanese commanders on Saipan understood they would receive no meaningful support from either sea or air. The conquest of Saipan took 3 weeks of savage combat and cost nearly 3,000 American lives, with over 13,000 wounded. But for the Japanese, the island's fall represented an unmitigated catastrophe. According to wartime Japanese military documents analyzed by post-war historians, fewer than 1,000 of Saito's 30,000 troops survived as prisoners. The rest died in combat or during mass suicide charges. The civilian population, indoctrinated with propaganda about American atrocities, threw themselves from cliffs, rather than surrender, creating scenes of horror that shocked even battle-hardened American Marines. Tokyo's response to Saipan's fall revealed the depth of Japanese terror regarding the island-hopping strategy's success. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government collapsed, replaced by General Kuniaki Koiso's administration, which immediately began searching for a way to reverse the catastrophic strategic situation. But replacing political leaders could not alter fundamental military realities. American engineers were already constructing airfields on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, from which Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers could reach Tokyo itself. The capture of Tinian in late July and Guam by early August completed American control of the Marianas and effectively sealed Japan's fate, though the war would grind on for another year. Japanese intelligence officers compiled desperate assessments of American capabilities, each report more alarming than the last. The Americans had demonstrated the ability to project massive force across thousands of miles of ocean, maintain complex logistics networks supporting hundreds of thousands of troops, and sustain combat operations indefinitely while simultaneously fighting a major war in Europe. What truly paralyzed Japanese strategic planning was the recognition that the island-hopping strategy had achieved its objective ahead of schedule. American forces had advanced from Guadalcanal to Saipan, over 4,000 miles, in less than 2 years, bypassing or destroying dozens of Japanese garrisons along the way. Imperial General Headquarters calculated TOs had at the current rate of advance, American forces would be positioned to invade the home islands by early 1945. Every Japanese defensive plan written after the fall of the Marianas was predicated not on victory, but on making the invasion of Japan so costly that America might accept something less than unconditional surrender. October 20th, 1944, marked General Douglas MacArthur's dramatic return to the Philippines, wading ashore at Island and fulfilling his famous promise to return. For the Japanese Empire, MacArthur's arrival represented the culmination of their worst strategic fears. American forces had successfully bypassed hundreds of miles of fortified positions, isolated tens of thousands of Japanese troops, and now threatened to sever Japan's vital supply lines to the resource-rich Dutch East Indies. The Philippine campaign showcased island hopping on a grand strategic scale. Rather than methodically recapturing every island in the vast Philippine archipelago, American forces seized key locations that would cut Japanese communications and supply routes. MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Forces and Nimitz's Central Pacific Forces had converged on the Philippines from different directions, demonstrating unprecedented operational coordination across thousands of miles of ocean. Japanese commanders found themselves defending a position that had been strategically outflanked before the first shot was fired. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commanding the combined fleet, recognized that the Philippines represented Japan's last chance to inflict a decisive defeat on American naval forces. He committed virtually every remaining surface combatant to the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history. The complex operation involved 3 separate Japanese task forces attempting to destroy American amphibious forces in Leyte Gulf through coordinated attacks. The plan's sophistication revealed Japanese naval competence, but its desperate nature exposed the Empire's strategic desperation. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought between October 23rd and 26th, resulted in catastrophic Japanese losses. American forces sank 4 Japanese carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 9 destroyers, while losing 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, and 3 destroyers. According to naval historians examining records from both nations, the battle effectively destroyed the Imperial Japanese Navy as a fighting force. Japan had gambled everything on stopping the American advance and lost decisively. The Empire's maritime commerce, already strangled by American submarine warfare, now faced total destruction. What made the Philippine campaign particularly terrifying for Japanese defenders was the emergence of kamikaze attacks, a desperate tactic born from the recognition that conventional warfare had failed completely. On October 25th, organized suicide attacks began when Japanese pilots deliberately crashed explosive-laden aircraft into American vessels. The kamikaze represented the logical endpoint of Japanese defensive strategy. When every conventional tactic had proven inadequate, only the sacrifice of pilots' lives offered any hope of inflicting meaningful damage on the American fleet. Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, who had conquered Singapore in 1942, now found himself commanding the defense of the Philippines against impossible odds. Yamashita possessed over 400,000 troops, but they were scattered across multiple islands with no realistic hope of mutual support. American control of the sea and air meant Yamashita's forces operated in complete isolation from each other and from Japan. He understood that defending the Philippines was a futile gesture, but Japanese military culture offered no acceptable alternative to fighting to the death. The systematic reduction of Japanese positions throughout the Philippines demonstrated island-hopping principles applied to a complex archipelago. American forces seized Leyte, then Mindoro, then Luzon, each operation building on previous successes while bypassing Japanese strongholds that no longer threatened American objectives. Japanese garrisons on Mia, Mindanao and other southern islands found themselves in the now familiar position of isolated defenders watching the war move past them. By early 1945, over 100,000 Japanese troops remained scattered throughout the Philippines, cut off from supply, and effectively removed from the war, despite still being combat capable. February 19, 1945, brought American Marines ashore on Iwo Jima, a desolate volcanic island that represented the most heavily fortified position American forces had yet encountered. The battle for this 8-square-mile speck of sulfurous rock would demonstrate both the terrible effectiveness and the horrific human cost of the island-hopping strategy as it approached Japan's home islands. For Japanese defenders, Iwo Jima symbolized their empire's final defensive line, the absolute last barrier before American forces reached the sacred soil of Japan itself. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi commanded Iwo Jima's defense with grim realism, uncommon among Japanese officers of that era. Having served as military attaché in Washington during the 1920s, Kuribayashi understood America's industrial capacity and had no illusions about ultimate victory. His 21,000 troops had transformed Iwo Jima into a subterranean fortress, with 11 miles of tunnels connecting artillery positions, ammunition stores, and troop quarters. Unlike previous Japanese commanders who emphasized beach defenses and suicidal banzai charges, Kuribayashi ordered his men to fight from concealed positions, inflicting maximum casualties while preserving their own strength as long as possible. The American assault on Iwo Jima cost nearly 7,000 Marine lives, with over 19,000 wounded, the only Pacific battle where American casualties exceeded Japanese losses. Every yard of volcanic ash and rock was purchased with blood as Marines fought through Kuribayashi's intricate defensive network. Mount Suribachi fell on the fourth day, producing the iconic flag-raising photograph that would symbolize American determination, but the battle for the island's northern plateau raged for 31 more days of brutal close-quarters combat. The strategic value of Iwo Jima justified its terrible price, though this provided cold comfort to the Marines fighting through its nightmarish terrain. The island sat directly beneath the flight path between the Marianas and Japan, enabling Japanese radar to provide early warning of American bomber raids while Japanese fighters harassed the massive B-29 formations. According to U.S. Army Air Force's records, captured Japanese documents revealed that defending Iwo Jima was considered essential to disrupting the American strategic bombing campaign that was steadily reducing Japanese cities to ashes. For Japanese defenders throughout the remaining Pacific garrisons, Iwo Jima's conquest confirmed their worst fears about the island-hopping strategy's endgame. American forces had now established bases just 650 miles from Tokyo. The entire Japanese home islands lay exposed to invasion, bombing, and naval blockade. Officers on isolated islands like Truk, which had once been considered Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific, understood with absolute clarity that their empire's defeat was inevitable. The only remaining question was how many more would die before Japan acknowledged reality. Kuribayashi's final radio transmission to Tokyo, sent on March 26 as his command post was being overrun, captured the desperate psychology of Japan's final defense. The battle is approaching its end. Since the enemy's landing, even the gods would weep at the bravery of the officers, and men under my command." Unlike many Japanese commanders who chose suicide over surrender, Kuribayashi likely died leading a final attack, his body never identified among the thousands of Japanese dead. His sophisticated defense had inflicted terrible casualties, but had not altered the war's trajectory by even a single day. The capture of Iwo Jima provided exactly what American planners had envisioned, an emergency landing field for damaged B-29 bombers returning from raids over Japan. By war's end, over 2,400 superfortresses would make emergency landings on Iwo Jima, saving approximately 24,000 aircrew lives. Japanese military intelligence reports documenting these landings revealed the psychological impact on Japan's leadership. The island-hopping strategy had successfully created an inescapable ring around the home islands, from which American air and naval forces launched increasingly devastating attacks against a nation that could no longer meaningfully resist. April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday, saw the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War as American forces stormed ashore on Okinawa, just 340 miles from Japan's southernmost home island of Kyushu. The invasion of Okinawa represented the culmination of the island-hopping strategy and a terrifying preview of what the invasion of Japan itself might entail. For Japanese military and civilian leaders alike, the fall of Okinawa would mean American forces stood literally on the doorstep of the sacred homeland. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima commanded over 77,000 Japanese troops on Okinawa, supplemented by approximately 20,000 Okinawan militia and civilian conscripts. Like Kuribayashi on Iwo Jima, Ushijima recognized that banzai charges and beach defenses had proven suicidal in previous battles. Instead, he positioned his forces in Okinawa's rugged southern highlands, creating a defense in depth that would force Americans to fight through multiple fortified lines, while exposed to constant artillery fire and counterattacks. The plan aimed to inflict such catastrophic casualties that American public opinion would accept a negotiated peace rather than face the even bloodier invasion of Japan proper. The battle for Okinawa became the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War, lasting 82 days and costing over 12,000 American lives with 36,000 wounded. Naval forces supporting the invasion faced the full fury of organized kamikaze attacks, with over 1,900 suicide sorties sinking 36 American ships and damaging 368 others. The kamikazes killed nearly 5,000 sailors, demonstrating that Japan's desperation had transformed warfare into something unprecedented in modern military history: the systematic weaponization of suicide on an industrial scale. The Japanese High Command had designated the defense of Okinawa as Operation Tengo, reflecting its status as Japan's final major defensive operation before the home islands themselves came under direct assault. Imperial General Headquarters committed virtually every remaining aircraft in Japan to supporting Okinawa's defense, including the suicidal surface sortie of the battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever constructed, which was dispatched with only fuel for a one-way voyage to beach itself on Okinawa as a stationary artillery platform. American carrier aircraft intercepted and sank the Yamato on April 7th, ending Japan's surface fleet as a factor in the war, while symbolically demonstrating that even the Empire's mightiest weapons were powerless against American air superiority. Okinawan civilians suffered horrifically as the battle transformed their home into a landscape of devastation. As documented in post-war studies by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey examining civilian casualties, approximately 100,000 Okinawan civilians died during the campaign, nearly one-third of the island's population. Japanese propaganda had convinced many civilians that Americans would torture and murder them, leading to mass suicides similar to those witnessed on Saipan. The civilian death toll shocked American forces and reinforced concerns about casualties in an invasion of Japan's home islands, where the population had been subjected to years of propaganda about American barbarism. The systematic destruction of Japanese defensive positions on Okinawa showcased the terrifying efficiency of America's combined arms approach. Naval gunfire, aerial bombardment, artillery barrages, flamethrower tanks, and infantry assault worked in coordinated precision to reduce each fortified position. Japanese defenders noted with despair that American forces demonstrated unlimited ammunition, fuel, and supplies, while Japanese stocks dwindled to nothing. Lieutenant General Ushijima and his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, committed ritual suicide on June 22 as American forces overran their final command post, ending organized resistance. The conquest of Okinawa provided American forces with extensive air bases and anchorages from which to launch the planned invasion of Japan. But the campaign's brutal cost, the highest casualty rate in the Pacific War, raised profound questions about the human price of that final assault. American military planners estimated that invading Japan's home islands might cost 1 million American casualties and several million Japanese deaths. These projections would influence President Harry Truman's decision to authorize the use of atomic weapons, though the ultimate necessity of that choice remains debated among historians. What remained undeniable was that the island-hopping strategy had successfully positioned American forces to deliver the coup de grace to the Japanese Empire through whatever means necessary. August 6, 1945, brought a blinding flash over Hiroshima that announced humanity's entrance into the atomic age. And with it came the sudden conclusion to a war that the island-hopping strategy had already won through conventional means. The Boeing B-29 superfortress named Enola Gay had departed from Tinian in the Mariana Islands, captured just 13 months earlier during the island-hopping campaign, to deliver a weapon that would kill over 140,000 people and force Japan's surrender within days. The atomic bombs represented the final consequence of a strategy that had systematically dismantled Japan's Pacific Empire island by island, base by base, until the home island stood defenseless before American power. The island-hopping strategy's success can be measured through stark statistics that reveal its devastating effectiveness. Between 1943 and 1945, American forces had advanced over 4,000 miles from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, while bypassing and neutralizing hundreds of Japanese garrisons containing over 200,000 troops. These isolated defenders consumed precious Japanese resources while contributing nothing to the empire's defense. Japanese military planners had predicted that their defensive perimeter would force years of costly American assaults, yet that perimeter had been shattered in less than 3 years of sustained offensive operations. The psychological impact on Japanese military leadership proved as decisive as any battlefield victory. According to post-war interrogations of Japanese commanders documented in the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, the strategy's unpredictability created a paralyzing uncertainty that degraded Japanese decision-making at every level. Commanders never knew where American forces would strike next, forcing them to disperse their remaining strength across hundreds of potential targets. When Americans did attack, they brought overwhelming force that made heroic defense meaningless. The Bushido Code that emphasized death over surrender became a liability when those deaths accomplished nothing except hastening the empire's collapse. Japanese garrisons on bypassed islands experienced a unique psychological torture. Approximately 100,000 Japanese troops survived the war on isolated islands where they had been cut off from supplies, reinforcements, and communication with the home islands. Soldiers on Truk, Rabaul, Wake Island, and dozens of other bypassed positions endured years of slow starvation, disease, and irrelevance while monitoring radio broadcasts describing Japan's steady defeat. Some garrisons didn't learn of Japan's surrender until weeks after the war officially ended on August 15, 1945. The psychological damage these abandoned soldiers suffered, the shame of surviving while their comrades died defending the homeland, would haunt Japanese society for decades. The strategic genius of island hopping lay in its fundamental understanding that geography was the Pacific War's decisive factor. American planners recognized that controlling key islands, even relatively small ones, could dominate vast ocean areas through air power and naval forces based at those locations. By seizing bases that extended American operational range while denying those same bases to Japan, the strategy created an inexorable momentum that Japanese forces proved incapable of countering. Each captured island shortened American supply lines while lengthening Japanese ones, compounding the empire's logistical disadvantages until collapse became inevitable. The human cost of this strategic success remains sobering even 8 decades later. American forces suffered approximately 111,000 combat deaths in the Pacific War, with hundreds of thousands more wounded. Japanese military deaths exceeded 2 million, while civilian deaths, from combat operations, strategic bombing, atomic weapons, and the starvation that accompanied Japan's economic collapse, may have exceeded 3 million. The island-hopping strategy, while more efficient than alternative approaches, still purchased victory through an almost incomprehensible expenditure of human life and suffering. Modern military strategists continue studying the island-hopping campaign as a masterclass in operational art, the linkage between tactical battles and strategic objectives. The strategy demonstrated how technological superiority, industrial capacity, and innovative thinking could defeat a determined enemy, despite their initial advantages in position and preparation. Japanese military culture's emphasis on fighting to the death proved counterproductive when facing an enemy who could simply bypass strongpoints and allow their defenders to perish in isolation. The strategy's success vindicated those American planners who argued for flexibility and creativity over the traditional approach of reducing each enemy position in sequence. The terror that island hopping inspired in Japanese military planners stemmed from their recognition that they had been strategically checkmated. No amount of courage, determination, or tactical skill could overcome the fundamental advantages that control of key island bases provided to American forces. Japanese commanders watched helplessly as the empire they had built through conquest crumbled under an American advance they could neither predict nor prevent. The strategy's psychological impact, the crushing certainty of inevitable defeat despite occasional tactical victories, may have been its most devastating weapon. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, he cited the endurance of the unendurable, a fitting epitaph for an empire that had been systematically dismantled by a strategy it had neither anticipated nor countered effectively, leaving a legacy that would reshape Pacific geopolitics for generations to come.